Why do we sometimes feel sadness for no apparent reason? Why does the heart ache even when nothing seems wrong? Could this quiet sorrow be a signal, not a symptom? In contemporary psychology, emotion is generally treated as a reaction, a response to something identifiable, a loss, a conflict, a stressful event, a memory. Every feeling, we assume, has a cause. Yet across cultures and times, people describe moments of deep sadness that arrive without narrative, a heaviness in the chest, a longing without object, a grief that has no face. Rumi, the 13th century Persian mystic, would not have considered this an error of the psyche. For him, it is a kind of perception, the soul's way of remembering something it has lost sight of. This sadness, he suggests, is not pathology but communication. It is the echo of awareness recognizing its distance from its source. The soul cries not because something is wrong, but because it remembers what once felt whole. To understand this, we must first look at how modern thought misinterprets such sorrow, reducing a metaphysical signal to a psychological malfunction in cognitive behavioral psychology. Emotions are typically understood as consequences of cognition, products of our thought patterns, interpretations, and external stimuli. Unexplained sadness is therefore treated as an anomaly, a possible hormonal imbalance, a trace of suppressed memory, or an early marker of depression. This approach is practical for therapy and medicine, but it has a limitation. It explains how emotions behave, not what they mean. Human emotion, however, has dimensions that cannot be reduced to biology alone. There are times when sadness functions not as reaction, but as recognition, a state of consciousness sensing its own misalignment. The modern world amplifies this misalignment. We live in an attention economy, overstimulated by information, yet undernourished by meaning. Viktor Frankl called this condition the existential vacuum, the silent grief that emerges when life is full of activity but empty of purpose. From a neuroscientific perspective, this is mirrored in what researchers call the default mode network, the brain's self-referential system that activates when the mind is not focused on external tasks. During rest, this network generates spontaneous reflections on identity, mortality, and belonging, often experienced as vague melancholy. The mind, in its idle state, becomes aware of its own incompleteness. Modern culture responds to such feelings with avoidance, distract, diagnose, or medicate. But Rumi invites a reversal of this reflex. He treats these moments of causeless sadness not as failures of mental health, but as openings, signs that something deeper is trying to reach awareness. Rumi did not regard the soul as a passive, emotional entity. He viewed it as a mirror of divine perception, the instrument through which the infinite becomes self-aware in human form. In this view, the soul does not simply feel. It recognizes. Its emotions are forms of perception, subtle ways of knowing. Rumi's famous image of the reed flute expresses this perfectly. Listen to the reed, he writes, how it tells a tale of separation. The reed's music is sorrowful because it has been cut from the reed bed. Its cry is not despair, but memory. Likewise, the soul's uncaused sadness is not depression. It is metaphysical homesickness, the awareness of having once belonged to something infinite and whole. This teaching was considered forbidden in rationalist frameworks because it resists reductionism. It suggests that emotion, rather than being noise in the system, can be signal from the real. Sadness, in Rumi's view, is not to be silenced or fixed, but decoded, for within it, the soul is speaking in its native tongue. Rumi draws from a Quranic verse where God addresses the unborn souls. Am I not your Lord? And they reply, yes. This, he says, is the origin of longing, a primordial recognition etched into the structure of consciousness. When the mind grows still, that buried memory re-emerges as a feeling of yearning, experienced as sadness without story. From a psychological standpoint, this parallels the idea of implicit memory, emotional recall that exists without conscious narrative. Neuroscience shows that the limbic system can generate affective states independent of explicit memory retrieval. In simpler terms, the body can remember feelings whose causes the mind has forgotten. Thus, Rumi's cry of remembrance corresponds to what science now calls non-verbal emotional memory, a resonance from experiences that exceed language. For Rumi, the soul is like a finely tuned instrument. When the surrounding environment vibrates at false frequencies, greed, noise, manipulation, distraction, it begins to ache. This ache is diagnostic, not pathological. It reveals the dissonance between what we inhabit and what we are. Rumi warns, don't get too comfortable in a world that doesn't sing your song. Modern research supports this intuition. Studies on emotional contagion demonstrate that the proportions human nervous system unconsciously mirrors the emotional states of others. Variations in vagal tone, the measure of parasympathetic balance, show how quickly we absorb the tension or harmony of our environment. This means that your sadness might not be entirely personal. It may be resonance with collective imbalance. For Rumi, to sense this dissonance is a mark of maturity. The awakened soul grieves not for itself, but for the disharmony of the world. In Rumi's metaphysics, pain is energy awaiting transformation. The wound, he wrote, is the place where the light enters you. Sorrow, then, is not an end point, but a process. The psyche's attempt to metabolize experience into insight. Neuroscience parallels this in its study of emotional integration. When strong emotions are consciously processed, activity shifts from the limbic system to the insular and anterior cingulate cortex regions involved in empathy, meaning-making, and self-awareness. Emotion becomes understanding. Rumi's law of transformation aligns with this. Every unprocessed feeling is unrefined perception. When attended to with awareness, it becomes knowledge. The soul's cry, therefore, is not weakness. It is the first stage of illumination. Sorrow is not a disorder of emotion, but a language of consciousness, a method through which the inner world communicates with awareness. If the divine is everywhere, how can the soul feel distant? Rumi resolves this paradox by distinguishing ontological unity from phenomenological experience. In reality, nothing is separate from the divine. All existence is one continuum of being, but consciousness. In order to recognize that unity must temporarily experience separation, just as the eye cannot see itself without a mirror. The soul cannot recognize its source without the illusion of distance. Uncaused sorrow is not error but evidence, the friction of consciousness, trying to remember what it already knows. This idea resonates with Plato's theory of anamnesis, that knowledge is remembrance, not acquisition. Rumi's insight extends this to emotion itself. Sadness is a mode of knowing. Not a failure of feeling. Your tears may not indicate weakness but intelligence. The soul's cognition expressed through affect. Rumi's insights can be translated into modern psychological practice without losing their spiritual depth. Don't run from your grief. Look for the message beneath its veil. Practically, this aligns with mindfulness-based affect labeling, observing and naming emotion without attaching a story. When you recognize a cry without cause, you interrupt emotional fusion and restore cognitive distance. Studies show that this act reduces limbic activation and increases regulation in the prefrontal cortex, allowing emotion to be integrated rather than suppressed. Ask yourself, what truth is this sadness asking me to notice? Instead of treating emotion as problem, treat it as information. Journaling, contemplative walking, or rhythmic breathing can facilitate this translation. In therapeutic language, this resembles emotional transmutation, converting raw affect into meaningful narrative. Rumi viewed harmony as spiritual hygiene. When attention, breath, and intention align, sadness loses its static quality. Research on heart rate variability supports this. Coherence between heart and breath restores parasympathetic calm and emotional stability. Physiological harmony mirrors what Rumi called the music of the heart. Remembrance is not ritual repetition, but reattunement to one's origin. In secular terms, this means consciously reconnecting with what evokes awe, silence, nature, poetry, or prayer. Such experiences recalibrate the nervous system toward openness and gratitude, reducing chronic emotional noise. When the soul cries, the task is not suppression but translation, to understand what awareness is trying to communicate through affect. The soul cries without reason because its reason is not psychological but metaphysical. What appears as causeless sadness is often one of three things: the echo of remembrance, the resonance of disharmony, or the signal of transformation. Rumi reframes sorrow as sacred intelligence, the bridge between emotion and consciousness. Modern neuroscience increasingly echoes this view. Emotions are not random. They are data, complex signals pointing toward integration. To dismiss sadness as dysfunction is to ignore one of the oldest languages of the human spirit. So, when that quiet ache arises, resist the impulse to pathologize it. Pause, listen. It may be your deepest intelligence speaking, the part of you that still remembers the real.